best to start this video with a 60-second recap on perspective. And that is, the important thing with buildings is eye level. Eye level is the level of eyes of the person observing the scene, or of the camera if it's a photo. And in this case, we're assuming that this ground is flat. So therefore, the eye level of the photographer or the camera is level with the eye level of people standing in the scene. So this is the eye level. Eye level is also important because all the perspective angles for a building on level ground meet on the eye level. So for instance, you'll have to take my word for it that if we draw all these lines out to where they meet and we continue eye level across, they will hit the same point on the eye level. And if we look at the right hand side, in fact, it's much easier to see that they do meet at the same point. And the other thing about eye level is that if there are any horizontal lines or alignments, such as the tops of windows, at that point, they give us a straight line, regardless of which wall they were on. So if we had windows actually at the eye level point, the tops of the windows would all be apparently in a straight line from this view. And it's important to remember how perspective and eye level works on flat ground when we look at buildings that are on ground that is sloping upwards, particularly if it's sloping upwards steeply. So let's have a look at that. Here's a quick sketch I did of an actual drawing I came across. And I chose it because it really has all of the problems that I often see with buildings that are on streets where the side street goes upwards fairly steeply. And yet, the general principles of perspective are still going to be the same. So how should they work here? Well, again, the important thing is to get eye level. And eye level is the point where we basically have a horizontal line. Now, there are no people here. Even if they were, we couldn't be sure that the camera isn't higher or lower than their eye level. So what we're looking for is, where is there the horizontal line? And we can see here that that line is not quite horizontal, but it's, that line is obviously not. So it's going to be closer to that line. So eye level is going to be about here. And we can already see a problem, because we can see that if someone's head was there, then this doorway is too high and narrow. So already there's this problem with the scale. The other thing we know about eye level is that the perspective lines should all meet on it. Now remember, all of these lines are meant to connect at the same point on eye level. And we can see that while these two perspective lines will probably meet at somewhere, it's going to be a very long way off the paper. This line hits eye level here. This perspective line hits eye level here. In fact, the lines don't align with eye level, and that's because of the problem with the drawing. One way of working out if our eye level is correct is to imagine a person in our scene. Where would they be standing? Now you might notice, looking at eye level then, I didn't use the bottom of the building line. And that's because this line does not count in perspective, because this line is not flat ground. This line actually slopes at an angle. And this is the line, of course, which causes the problem. But really the problem is that the artist has not observed the building reference, whether it's in real life or a photo, accurately enough. Because if they had, they'd have seen that this is not the way it looks in real life. Because what we have here is a series of windows that get impossibly short too quickly. And yet we have these windows above them that decrease in size with the perspective at a much less rapid rate. If we were to draw figures that, say, came halfway up these long windows, we can see, in fact, that the figures just get too small too quickly. They're tiny up here or very large down here. And that's because the scale of this is incorrect, because the perspective is incorrect, because this is not actually how the building looks. And when we have this problem that somehow the windows all seem to disappear into nothing too quickly, it's because we've been drawing what we've rushed ahead and imagined it to look like with what we know of perspective and what we know of the building, without actually looking to see what's really happening. So let me look at two buildings that have very steep street frontages to see two possibilities of what might be happening. Now here we have the back of an old hotel. This is a steep street. So let's just see where our perspective lines meet up. We can see that they're meeting up in the same place. And if we were to put a line here, then we see that it's about here. Now, this is a very tall door. It was probably actually once a garage door. These were garages of the hotel originally. And it's probably actually just a little bit higher. But roughly, this is eye level of our drawing. And the important thing to notice is that this line doesn't line up with the perspective angles and eye level because it's not horizontal. If we were to stand square onto this building and look at it straight on, this bottom line is not horizontal. So therefore it doesn't obey the rules of perspective. So we simply need to observe it carefully when we draw it. In fact, if the ground was flat, this line, this green line, would be where the bottom of the building is. And then all of these spaces would actually be the same. But when we get rid of those and look more carefully, what we actually see is that we have changes in level as the building goes upwards. So in this part, for instance, we have this large door here. But because the road's going uphill, this space gets less and less because the windows stay the same. So something has to change. In these windows, they also stay the same. And again, we see there's a change here in, if you like, where the base of them are. We have this line here. Now, when we get further up the street, something different happens again. The architects used a different way to allow for the steep street. He's wanted all of these garage doors to be the same height, but instead of making the adjustment down the bottom, he's made it at the top because the doors obviously have to reach the ground. And so we have this line that follows the perspective angles, but the gap between the top and the doors and this line decreases as the doors go up the hill. So what happens when a building is on a steep slope is that there has to be adjustment somewhere to compensate for that, because the perspective rules don't apply anymore for this lower part of the drawing because the ground level line is not flat, is not horizontal. And that's why careful observation is key to drawing a building which is on a steeply sloping uphill road. Now here's another example where the architect has dealt with this in a different way. Let's just get our perspective lines. They all meet at the same point, and we know that point is going to be our eye level. And so eye level is going to be about here. And we can see, in fact, that yes, the bottoms of these windows pretty much line up, and we can see that works with our perspective points. However, what the architect has done is this is the ground level, and we see that this line level, which is the lowest line we have right across the building, of course doesn't go through eye level at the same place. And what that means is, in this lower level, we don't have windows of equal height. What's happened in this building is that the architect has chosen to reduce the height of these windows, and I imagine has excavated in the building to get the height that they don't have on this ground floor wall because of the street sloping upwards. And so this is a different way of approaching. And what we have to see is, in fact, these windows change proportions as they move along. The windows here getting shorter as they go to the left is not because of perspective completely, but it's mostly because the architect has designed them to be shorter because the ground is coming up to meet the ceiling above them. So what we have here is a different architectural solution to the problem of a steeply sloping block than we have here. And the important thing to realize is that this line or this line are not part of our perspective lines. They don't meet the other perspective lines on our vanishing point. And we have the same problem up here, where these lines are coming down at an angle. But we've assumed that somehow this is a perspective line and we have to squeeze all these elements in. What we need to do is to realize that this line is not a perspective line, and exactly how windows and doorways are brought into the wall will depend on how the architect has designed the building. And then in fact, from building to building, doors and windows will change levels. You won't necessarily get this lovely straight row alignment of windows on every level except for the bottom one. This happens because this is one building. But if we look up here, what we can see of this building adjacent to it, we can actually see that the windows do not line up with these windows because the architect for this building has taken a totally different approach to the slope of the street. So in summary, to avoid this sort of problem, the important thing is to realize is that where the ground is not horizontal, where there is a slope going upwards, that this bottom line along the edge of the buildings where they reach the ground is not a perspective angle. And if we think it is, it causes all sorts of awkward narrow-ins between it and the perspective lines above that just don't leave room for a building and cause all sorts of scale problems if we were to try and draw a series of people walking up the street. What we also need to do for every scene is to work out where the eye level actually is, because that will help make clear to us exactly what our perspective lines should be doing. And if we're drawing a relatively simple building that's all on horizontal ground, then our simple perspective diagrams are more obviously applicable. But when our building is complicated by being on steeply sloping ground, this line is not a perspective line. And because the architect will have to have employed some irregularity in the way he's designed this ground floor area to cope with the sloping ground, observation is even more important, and if we don't get it right, we end up with all sorts of perspective and scale problems. It's not really so complicated, but we have to understand these basic principles. I'm Stephen Travers. I hope this has cleared up some of the issues of drawing buildings on ground which is sloping upwards. If you found this helpful, then why not look at my other video of drawing buildings when the ground is sloping down away from us, which I think is generally a more challenging situation to try and draw. But again, once we know the basic principles, it's actually easier to observe them more accurately in real life or in our reference, and therefore we have a much better chance of drawing it accurately. We can't draw accurately what we haven't observed or realized in real life. Don't be put off by drawing buildings on steeply sloping ground. They can add a lot of visual interest, but they do present challenges for scale and perspective. So give it a go. All the best. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.